We're going to go to item 4.4. Vice Chancellor Michalowski, please.
All right. You're going to have a subsequent item to talk about several areas where we are doing implementation of the Student Success Task Force recommendations, but this is one that we're going to bring to you in a little bit more depth. Initially, the Student Success Task Force spent a lot of time on this issue of establishing system-wide enrollment priorities. Essentially, the task force recognized a real crisis that we're facing currently where the system cannot accommodate all of the students who wish to enroll in our classes. And we are, in effect, Chancellor Scott has often said, we are rationing enrollment now. We just aren't doing it on any kind of a rational basis. We're doing it simply, those who get into the system have top priority to stay in the system, but we've never thought through relative priorities for different kinds of students. So the task force wanted to ensure that we were providing enrollment priority for students who are really part of our core mission, students who are enrolling for a degree, certificate, transfer, or career advancement. Third, the task force wanted to ensure that new students coming into the system get off on the right foot and are encouraged to take advantage, are directed to take advantage of the services that we know make a difference in their likelihood of succeeding. So we wanted to direct new students to orientation, assessment, and make sure they develop an education plan. And then fourth, we wanted to incentivize and reward those students who make good progress towards their objective. And so those were the four areas where the task force set its work. And so the task force said that enrollment priority should go to continuing students in good academic standing who are making progress towards a degree, certificate, transfer, or career advancement. And that would include students who are taking basic skills courses in order to accomplish those goals. And also, priority should go to new students who do undergo orientation, assessment, and develop an education plan. And then the task force recognized that there are certain groups that have statutory enrollment priority, that there's longstanding provisions, fairly longstanding provisions for active duty military and veterans. There are newer provisions for foster youth and some former foster youth. And then the system has had a longstanding policy to give priority enrollment to EOPS and DSPNS students. Interestingly, those two groups of students are recognized in Title V regulations. In both cases, there's language that encourages priority registration for those groups, that certainly authorizes colleges to provide it, that encourages programs to provide it as part of their admission services, but there's nothing that actually requires it. So with that direction from the task force, the task force also talked about what it means to be a continuing student in good standing. And there are current Title V regulations that say that if a student, once they've taken 12 units, if a student fails to maintain at least a 2.0 GPA, they are to be placed on academic probation. And if a student, again, after they've completed 12 units, fails to complete at least 50% of the units in which they enroll, that student is to be put on progress probation. Those are existing Title V regulations, and the colleges are fairly consistent about implementing those. In the current Title V regulations, however, there is less clear, there is no mandate as far as what happens to a student who's put on probation. And so we know that practices throughout the system vary significantly from one community college to another. So the task force said that if a student is placed on probation for either of those reasons for 2 consecutive terms, that would result in loss of good academic standing and should result in loss of priority enrollment. The same criterion also applies in the task force's recommendations to eligibility for the Board of Governors fee waiver. And while other provisions related to the BOG fee waiver have been amended in SB 1456, that requirement remains, that a student would have to remain in good academic standing by that definition. And then finally, good academic standing for purposes of enrollment priority would mean not exceeding 100 units. And from that 100 units, we would exclude ESL and non-degree applicable basic skills courses. So with that direction from the task force, we convened a fairly broad-based work group to try to draft some regulations that you have in your agenda item as a draft. The work group consists of 2 vice presidents of student services, vice presidents of instruction, 4 faculty, 2 students, 2 admissions and registrars, admissions officers, a CEO, a chief business officer, a representative of career technical education, a researcher, and someone from the EOPS Association. That group has been working very hard, and I want to acknowledge Sonia Ortiz-Mercado, who's the Dean of Student Services on my staff, and our counsel, Steve Bruckman, who've done a great deal of work with that group. So we actually drafted regulations, and those have been widely circulated for input throughout the system. We brought them to consultation earlier, well, in April, and I think that the reaction has been, by and large, that we have a solid framework for approaching this issue. However, it is a very significant issue, and it's also very complex in terms of how it would work out. And so after the discussion at the Consultation Council, I think that everyone was in agreement that we would be better served to bring this to you as an information item now, allow a couple of extra months to get additional input and make sure we get it right. And then it's our expectation that we'll be bringing these back to you for first reading in July. I can walk through or at least I want to call your attention to this chart that was part of the supplemental materials that you received after the agenda was published, because this kind of lays out the approach that the task force has taken. We have said that we've broken priority into 3 groups. The first is the 2 groups who have priority in the education code. And that's, active duty military veterans who I think is currently veterans within 4 years of separation, but there's a bill now to extend that to 15 years. So for all practical purposes, it's our veterans. And then foster youth and emancipated foster youth. Those are specified in the education code as getting registration priority. However, we do want those students to be successful, and so we're specifying that it's those students who go through what will now be requirements for all new students to have registration priority, and that means going through orientation, assessment, and developing an education plan. The second group is the categories who are currently being given registration priority under Title V regulations, and that's EOPS and DSPS students. The third group then is a very large group. It includes new students who have undergone orientation, assessment, and an ed plan that leads to a core mission goal, and continuing students in good standing who are pursuing such a goal. Within that very large group, community college districts would have the ability to set their own priorities. And we have looked at numerous colleges that have special programs. The chancellor earlier mentioned the Long Beach program, the Long Beach Promise, where they work directly with their high school seniors in feeder high schools and try to get them enrolled in the college before they're even finished in high school. So this would allow a district to do that, while making sure that the broad priorities established by the Student Success Task Force are accomplished in the law. Within the draft regulations, after spelling out those three groups, it says that to the extent districts have the resources to do more than provide those critical matriculation services to new students, they could also require it of continuing students if they chose to. And then it also would explicitly authorize districts to set priorities among groups that are below those groups that don't have that level of priority. It would also require districts to have an appeal process for students who argue that they should not have lost enrollment priority based on extenuating circumstances. And it would authorize districts to provide exemptions for students in certain groups. For example, looking at the 100-unit cap, perhaps a district would choose to exempt students who are in high unit programs from that cap. Or an alternative approach would be to have the cap and then use that as an appeal criterion if a student was unable to complete within the 100 units. So that's the approach that we've taken, and that's kind of where the draft regulations stand right now. There are a number of issues that remain to be worked out, and so let me just quickly tell you what those are. One very important issue is how to actually deal with timing and implementation of this for continuing students, because by the time you know that a student is on probation for the second term, it's the end of that term, and the student will have already exercised whatever priority they had to register for the subsequent term. So do we want a situation where we're penalizing students a term after the fact, even though in that intervening term the student may cure their GPA or cure their progress rate, and then it's it's unfortunate that they're going to suffer a penalty from something that they've already fixed. So we've been talking actively with the Chief Student Services Officers and the admissions folks and counselors, trying to figure out whether there's an alternative to that by perhaps checking progress midterm and letting students know that their early registration is provisional, and if they don't cure their GPA and or progress rate by the end of that term, that they will lose their enrollment and have to re-register during open enrollment. That's an idea that's now on the table. But what the draft regulations say is that we will implement this in the next term for which registration occurs after the second term of probation has been achieved. Another issue is we've been hearing, and I think you will hear from EOPS and DSP&S representatives and perhaps CalWORKS representatives as well. For EOPS and DSPS, they are not comfortable being in a second category when historically we have said that we have recommended to districts that they treat all of the 4 groups as the same top priority group. And so because we're now actually regulating a requirement that EOPS and DSPS have enrollment priority, we felt that it was appropriate to have one category for the statutory groups and a second category for the regulatory groups. And the CalWORKS has made the argument that on many campuses, the CalWORKS students are given registration priority alongside EOPS students, whether or not they are. In many cases, they are EOPS students. And because the CalWORKS students are time limited, there's certainly arguments to be made that they do need registration priority, but that's not currently accommodated within the draft. And then the third issue, the last issue I wanted to point out, which is maybe the most problematic, is how to require students to do something that our institutions are not currently able to support. And that is most problematic with regard to education plans. So we are actively talking with the Matriculation Advisory Committee and with our counseling groups and others about the definition of an education plan. What can we expect that colleges can provide for students when they first enroll? What are those minimum standards that, that we can ensure will get students off on a good foot? And then how do we develop, that, you know, there'd be a more fully developed education plan once the student is there for a semester and has begun to, you know, more clearly define their educational goals and give the college the opportunity to work with them. So that's kind of an overview of what we've done, where we are, and I'm happy to answer any questions.
Member Mayamed.
I just have a small request. If you could list the names of the people on the committee the next time it comes to us, I enjoy looking at that. Thank you.
Member Belinsky.
I didn't hear that. Can I?
I asked her to list the names of the people
Oh,
on this committee.
thank you. I list the names.
I would be interested in who they are.
Yeah, thank you. Just to say thank you, especially thank you for delaying this from a first reading to an informational item. And as we go through this stuff, I'd go through this material, I'd point out the April 23rd question and answer, because it is quite good and I think is very informative to folks, rather than just reading proposed language for Title V, to actually have some questions and answers brought. And one of the questions that I had, and I just want to say it out loud because it's also in some sense within the answers here, but I had raised the question about where do international students and out-of-state students factor into the priorities, and what I was told is that would be a local decision as to those students as groups, and depending upon how you would prioritize the groups. So thank you on that. Just a couple of comments on things that were said from an experiential basis. The notion of trying to determine mid-semester if a student's going to pass the semester, that's going to need some real thought, because I could see that being just an avalanche. In our own EOPS program, trying to get students to bring in from their professors a written statement of how they're doing so they can take it to their EOPS counselor, that alone is challenging. So to say that possibly you might have 400 students who might be, that needs some, from my point of view and from an experiential basis, needs some looking into. One other thing that I'd like to just say publicly, because I think if we're moving in this direction, and we are, it really needs to be said to the districts where we're going strongly, and possibly even a potential timeline, because the problem I see that can come about is not preparing in advance, and therefore not programming the enterprise management system to take care of this. I will say in my own district, because of a programming flaw, we had to shut registration down on Friday, because there was a flaw in the prioritization on Friday, and some students with priority were getting to register and some weren't, and it was all a programming issue within the PeopleSoft system, because we use PeopleSoft. So the colleges need to know this. It's to pilot it, test it, experiment with it, see what the issues, not about doing it, but actually having it in the electronic systems. That's where we are today. And I do have one question, because I didn't realize that this was true at the moment. We can require students to do assessment and orientation, or strongly urge?
We believe you can already require it.
Really?
It's always been a little bit ambiguous, and so SB 1456 would make it explicit that colleges
Okay.
can require
Only when
students
that's
to
passed,
avail
though.
themselves of those services.
But when that's passed, not, because I mean the local interpretation has always been that you can strongly encourage. Thank you.
Member McDougall.
Linda, just a information question. What program would you use as an example of a program that has so many units that it would exceed the 100 unit level? I'm not aware of any, that's why I asked the question. just doesn't,
Well, our nursing programs are notoriously high unit programs. I don't think that, that program itself requires 100 units, but the fact that students have more units to complete means that they would need, we're building in an assumption that because students don't always enroll full-time, that because students have to repeat some classes, that because students don't always decide their clear major and stick with it, that they need more than the number of units that would require to get to a program. So a typical community college program is 60 units, and we're saying the limit is 100 units. So it's giving them, 40% more units in order to get to the 60 unit level. If someone wanted to increase that 100 units to 120 units for an 80 unit program, perhaps that would be appropriate, but that would be a local decision.
Okay, Vice President Baca, I think we have some speakers, correct?
We do. Will Bruce from the EOPS Association.
President Hamelstein, Vice President Baca, Jack Scott, members of the board. First, I would like to announce that it was no secret from the beginning EOPS Association was opposed to 3.1 enrollment priorities because we felt that our students would be in danger to being pushed to the back of the bus, so to speak. We were ensured at the Student Success Task Force, members of the task force, and it was on public record that EOPS and DSPNS would be left alone, that our enrollment priority would remain the same. So we were told that was a promise, and so we backed off at 3.1 and took it off the table, and we support enrollment priorities statewide, as long as it doesn't affect our students. And we were surprised to see this on the table by moving us to the second day or second priority. One of the reasons why in there it says because the first group is education in education code. Well, am I still here? Hello. If the document that you see in front of you, education code 69640, it's 5 pages of a program called EOPS. It's in education code. This document that was written back in 1969 was well thought out, and I mean it's a perfect document. It, tells EOPS is in here, and it even has provision of college registration. The intent of the legislators was to give EOPS students priority registration. For 43 years, it was legal precedent has been set for first day priority registration for our EOPS students, and then again for DSPNS students with ADA. Together, collectively, we worked together with DSPNS for many years and combine our forces and use priority registration days with our counselors to support all of our students on these days. When the vets and the foster care came on board on our day, we invited them into the group as well. Most of them were in our program. Vets are in Disabled Student Services and EOPS. All of the foster care kids, if they're in 12 units, are in EOPS. A lot of the campuses around have been streamlining our efforts and supporting these programs. It's funny that the Student Success Task Force recommendations say we should streamline, and that's what we've been doing, and so continue to let us continue to streamline. If you break us up into 2 groups, you're going to silo the 2 groups, and you're creating a new silo. The vets and the foster care, they don't have their own counselors. They use our counselors, and we support that. One of the things that the Student Success Task Force recommendations, or the Student Success Task Force has always said, EOPS is the model program. Priority enrollment is the lifeblood of the EOPS program. EOPS students must meet tremendous requirements to maintain eligibility for the program. One of these requirements is full-time enrollment. EOPS and DSPN students have been given first priority registration for a number of years. A clear legal precedent has been established that is now set to be undermined. As EOPS was created to ensure equal access for students facing significant educational and financial disadvantage, and a statute that holds EOPS students as a lower standing violates this very fundamental principle. Precedents and recommendations from the Chancellor's Office has been established for EOPS students should always be placed in the first group of students. We see no reason to go against this now, and thank you for your time.
Jose Vallejo, EOPS Association. Again, I remind you that speakers are limited to 3 minutes each.
Good afternoon, President Hammerstein and Chancellor Scott, and board members and board members. I'm here like my colleague Will and another colleague's coming up to share some information and give you some feedback in regards to this informational piece you have in front of you. We as a association support the components of the Student Success Task Force, which mirrors what EOPS has been practicing for, as Will mentioned, 43 years. In fact, if you look at the 4.4 handout that you received, it outlines the 4 components of recommendation 3.1 to be adopted statewide for enrollment priorities. If you look at those 4 components, it's essentially what EOPS does as a program. Probably we do it even more intrusive with our students. We move our students successfully through the system within a 6-semester or 7-degree applicable unit timeline. I am here, therefore, to respectfully ask the board to affirm first priority registration for EOPS students and not relegate them to second tier. First priority registration for all programs, that is EOPS, DSPS, vets, and foster youth, is not only best practices, but what works best for students. Currently, it's a system that's functioning and it's being used widely throughout the state. And we feel that it should not be changed. I thank you for your time.
Irma Rodriguez, EOPS Association.
Good afternoon, members, board members, and Chancellor Scott. We passed around some information with regards to past and current priority enrollment policies and practices. So if you would please draw your attention to 2 implementation advisories that you received, please. The first was from the State Chancellor's Office, SB 272, dated December 13, 2007, which provided for priority enrollment for veterans, and AB 194, written October 25, 2011, providing priority enrollment for foster youth. I'll be reading from the most recent advisory, AB 194, which, when addressing implementation, states, and I tried to highlight most of the documents for you. Current law also provides enrollment priority for other student groups. Education Code 66025.8 requires districts to provide enrollment priority for current members of the military and certain veterans, and Title V regulations also grant priority registration to EOPS students 58108 and 56232, and students with disabilities 56026. There is nothing in the law that defines the relative priority of the 4 groups identified in Education Code and Title V regulations. As such, we are advising districts that all 4 groups should have equal and first opportunity to enroll in courses for terms that begin January 1st, 2012. This was an implementation advisory for the foster youth that joined first priority. The current priority enrollment flow chart that you received has EOPS and DSPS second. The EOPS Association respectfully asks the Board of Governors, as you review information related to setting priority enrollment priorities, that you move to affirm the past practices of the past practices and the 2 Chancellor's Office prior advisories, and support strong language for the provision of first priority for veterans, foster youth, students with disabilities, DSPS students, and EOPS students, educationally and economically disadvantaged students who are continuing in good standing and fully matriculated, and second priority for continuing students in good standing that have matriculated. The EOPS Association strongly believes that the current practice and policy advisories do not have to change in order to implement the Student Success Task Force initiative. Low-income, educationally disadvantaged, and disabled students do not need to be displaced from first priority. We all go first now. Districts already have this in place. It has been the practice for decades. We ask the current practice and policy be reaffirmed regarding the first priority groups, and focus our energies on dealing with the continuing students existing in our colleges. Thank you.
Peter White, Chief Student Service Officers.
Members of the board, Chancellor Scott, and my colleagues in the State Chancellor's Office, I'm Peter White. I'm Vice President of Student Services at San Diego City College, and I serve as the President of the State CSSO Association. First of all, I need to thank my colleagues in the Chancellor's Office, particularly Vice Chancellor Michalowski and Dean Sonia Ortiz, for the frankly outstanding job they've done in shepherding this discussion through the work group and in very frequent, detailed, and I hope useful for you, because they certainly have been for the CSSOs, conference calls with the CSSO board on a regular basis to focus in on the details and the very difficult details of implementing this proposed set of regulations. I want to make clear that the CSSOs as a whole and very strongly support linking priority access, priority registration access, to the use of matriculation services, to the student's good academic standing and progress, and to a certain unit accumulation after which that priority would be lost. We also believe that the draft regulations allow for sufficient local autonomy, if you will, or at least wiggle room in terms of an appeal and or exemption process for those cases, we hope they're rare, where we would need to consider alternatives to these rules. But where we strongly disagree with the current draft regulations is in the distinction they draw between groups 1 and 2, as outlined by others this afternoon. The CSSOs have advocated and will continue to advocate for merging what the draft regulations call groups 1 and 2 into one single group, and we'll do so both in the work group through our representatives and in future meetings of the Board of Governors where you consider these regulations. A second concern, I think, was very, very well outlined by Vice Chancellor Michalowski. The devil is in the details. How we are able to implement the 2 semesters of academic or progress probation in a way that deprioritizes a student but doesn't cast the student into, frankly, the desert of open enrollment, and that's where we are now with the limited courses we offer, is going to require some additional work, and I appreciate your postponing consideration of the regulations and allowing more time for a discussion of that. So on that note, I have a request of the board from the CSSOs. Take as much time as it takes to do this right and do it just once. We don't have the luxury at the colleges of coming back a year from now, 2 years from now, and tweaking and modifying and correcting things we moved too hastily on or forgot because we felt that we were under some obligation to get regulations in place lickety-split. We understand the need for an enhanced priority enrollment, but please, in this case, our enemy will be haste.
Jamie Dillard, Butte College DSPNS Director.
Good afternoon. Thank you for allowing me to speak. I'm Jamie Dillard. I'm the Director of Disabled Student Programs and Services at Butte College. Wanted to state my concern for the proposal to place students with disabilities in the second priority for registration eligibility. As many of you know, federal law, including the Americans with Disabilities Act, mandates that colleges provide accommodations to students with disabilities. Priority registration has been a very effective accommodation historically. By authorizing students with disabilities to receive the highest level of priority registration, they are those students that are able to schedule classes in close proximity to each other if they have a mobility disability and have trouble traversing the campus. For students with hearing impairments, and in parts of the state like mine, we're in a rural area where there's a shortage of qualified interpreters, it allows us to maximize efficiency so that students with hearing impairments can schedule classes together with other students with hearing impairments who require interpreting services. Finally, I just want to state I'm in support of the KPED proposal to include regulation language that ensures students with disabilities are given the highest priority for registration. Thank you.
Ralph Black, capped. Okay, brother.
Good afternoon again, Chancellor Scott and members of the board. My name is Ralph Black with the California Association on Post-Secondary Education and Disability. In her presentation, Vice Chancellor Miskalowski mentioned that the reason that the draft regulation has been written the way it is that veterans and foster youth have priority in state statute over the groups such as EOPS and DSPS, whose registration priority is set forth only in the Title V regulations. But as Ms. Dillard mentioned, there is another law in play here, the Americans with Disabilities Act, which is a federal statute which would take precedence even over the state education code, which provides that students with disabilities are entitled to accommodations. And quite frequently, this is providing priority registration is the most effective way to accommodate students with disabilities. If you have a limited number of classrooms that are in accessible buildings, you need to be sure that the students with mobility impairments can get into those classes in the buildings that are accessible. And there's a mention the need to schedule sign language interpreters and so forth. So it's fine if the board wants to adopt a precedence that students who are in good academic standing and working towards a degree have priority over those who don't. KPED has no objection to that. But for those students who meet whatever academic criteria you've established, students with disabilities need to be among the highest priority group. And we would certainly echo the comments of Peter White that all four of the traditional high priority groups should be merged together. At a minimum, students with disabilities need to be acknowledged that when there is an accommodation that's necessary, they should get the highest priority. Now, we've talked to the Chancellor's Office staff about this. They agree with the understanding that the ADA takes precedence here, but they did not want to put it into the regulation. They offered to put language to that effect into an FAQ statement. But we are concerned that people may not read the FAQ. 5 years from now, they will have lost it, and all they'll have is the regulation, and they won't realize that students with disabilities are entitled to that highest level of priority as a matter of federal law. Besides that, if all the veterans and the foster youth fill up all the classes in the first priority, then it will be difficult to remedy that situation for students with disabilities if you haven't built that into your registration priorities. So we believe that the language of the regulation should be revised and that it should be placed in the regulation when it's brought back to the Board of Governors for enactment. Thank you.
Melissa Jacobs, CalWorks.
Hi, good afternoon, Chancellor Scott, President Goldstein, and board. My name is Melissa Jacobs, and I am the district-wide coordinator for CalWorks here at the Los Rios Community College District in Sacramento. And I'm coming to you today as the president-elect of the California Community Colleges CalWorks Association, merely to just suggest and hopefully spark some conversation about including CalWorks students, all CalWorks students, in the conversation regarding priority enrollment due to the factors that are inherent in their situation as parents living in poverty, factors such as obtaining and sustaining childcare, transportation, and of course the ever-changing regulations from the State Department of Social Services regarding cash aid assistance. So, thank you.
Ruth Wallen?
Thank you, Board. As a student with a disability, having priority registration has been a great benefit in a number of ways. Not only does it ensure that I get the classes that I need, but it allows me time to find support in the classroom, as well as getting my books in advance so that I can take them over to the adaptive technology person to get my textbooks transcribed into a format that is readable for me. And given that the budget cuts has decreased the staff within the DSPS department, and we are only provided with one adaptive technology person who transcribes all of the materials for DSPNS students. It's a great advantage to know what my classes are well in advance, so that I can then purchase my books and take them over before the end of the current semester ends and the new semester begins. So I ask you to please consider keeping DSPNS as a priority registration. Thank you.
Okay. As this is an information item only, we don't need any action. Do any other board members have comments? Member Baum.
I saw Ning had hers. I was just going to say I appreciate all the comments that we heard from the DSPS community and EOPS community, but I want to say I really appreciate the work of the Chancellor's Office and the task force to establish these. And I, for one, though, still feel we're not taking anybody's priority away. Yeah. And we're, in fact, the task force is actually working to increase access for all. And I strongly endorse a top priority, though, for foster youth and veterans. I think that is a moral imperative that I support strongly.
Okay. Member.
With all the comments from all the public and everyone, I would like to recommend maybe to Chancellor, Vice Chancellor, that they take in consideration to combine DSPS students with the first priority with the current foster youth and military. As for me, I'm a past foster youth as well as DSPS student. I know that both those priorities has helped me to get to the classes I need. I arrange whatever else things that I need to help me to get to where I am today. And also, so if you could just consider that. I also have a question on the academic conditions for the 100-unit threshold. Is that basic skills included, or
no.
Just all?
It would only include courses that are basic skills and degree applicable. If they're non-degree applicable basic skills or ESL courses, they would not be included.
Thank you.
Member Vice President Baca.
Can you take me through maybe just a little bit more of the discussion with regard to establishing the two-tier? I recognize the difference in language in ed code, but you know, maybe just a little bit more in terms of the
We'll ask our attorney to do that.
Yes. Yeah, there's a nuance and a subtlety here that is important to understand. There are three different areas or sources of law that we're dealing with. There's the federal law, which is the Americans with Disabilities Act, and it's correct that takes precedence over state law. Then we have our state law passed by the legislature and signed by the governor that provides priority for foster youth and veterans. And then we have our Title V regulations that provide that students in the DSPS program and EOPS program shall be provided with certain types of assistance, And one of those types of assistance is in the registration process. Over the years, that assistance has become sort of institutionalized as a registration priority. But the Title V does not provide for registration priority. It provides for assistance, whereas the legislation passed by the California legislature clearly provides for a registration priority. In terms of the conflict, if you will, between the Americans with Disabilities Act and this regulation and the state law, the Americans with Disabilities Act provides that a student with a disability who requires a reasonable accommodation shall receive that accommodation. There's no question about that. And if the accommodation that the student requires is registration priority, then that student shall receive that registration priority. There are many situations where a student with a disability requires an accommodation other than a disability, other than a registration priority, access issues and all sorts of other issues. And the Americans with Disabilities Act is very different from the DSPS program. The interpretation of statewide is that if you're participating in the DSPS program, you have registration priority. That's a much larger universe of students than those students who have a disability under the Americans with Disabilities Act, and that disability can be best accommodated by registration priority. So we're dealing with different different groups of students, and it is correct that we could include in this regulation a statement to the effect that the Americans with Disabilities Act, if applicable, requires priority. However, that would not apply to DSPS generally. So it would create a confusion in my mind between students who are getting an accommodation under the ADA and students who are receiving a benefit as a result of being DSPS students. So that's why we at this point don't have it in the regulation. We would prefer to have that in explanatory materials. And just a final point, it's mentioned in one of the frequently asked questions that one of the reasons why we would not have the DSPS and EOPS raised to the same level as the groups that are recognized in statute is that it would open the door to really any other group to be raised to that level. For example, today we heard about the CalWorks students. There may be very good reason for CalWorks students to have priority. Other people may think that first-time students should have the highest priority. Well, we can't give highest priority to everybody, but we are required to give highest priority to those students that are, to those groups that we are directed to by the Education Code, which is the foster youth and the veterans, and we're required to give highest priority to those students who require registration priority as a result of a disability. Is that helpful?
Yes.
Yeah, it is. I guess the only follow-up question I'd have dealing with DSPNS, and maybe Vice Chancellor Makalowski is more directed to you, is the idea of separating DSPNS in terms of those that would be eligible and not eligible. Is that really, would that be efficient enough? Is it? It seems like it'd be more complicated than it's worth.
It certainly would add workload to have to, certify every student who asserted that they needed enrollment priority as an accommodation, and then to document that and then to cause that to occur. It's probably a significant number or percentage of DSPS students who, would strongly benefit, and the college also saves money if they can serve the DSPNS students efficiently by, for example, getting the hearing impaired students into a single class section so that you're paying for one interpreter instead of paying for several. So, I mean, there are certainly arguments, and I think that there's probably a discussion that the work group will continue to have.
Just one more in terms of impact. gauged what that might mean in terms of setting this two-tier and the impact that it has on DSPNS and EOPS with the change and current?
The total numbers system-wide are not huge. It's not a huge, none of the 4 groups constitutes a huge percentage of our population. So theoretically, it should be possible to accommodate all 4 without adverse impact. However, we've not dug in to determine whether it might have impact on particular campuses or in particular classes. I can envision, areas where there could be students who are in one of those 4 groups who might not get their first choice courses. Another issue that's been raised on the task force and by a number of the campuses is summer session. So many colleges have cut back their summer sessions so severely that it's very possible for every single seat to be taken up by the top priority students, and all of those students don't even get the classes that they need.
And I would add, I don't know that we've done a complete survey of this, but I have seen statistics indicating that there are 1 or 2 or perhaps a few more colleges that have a significantly higher number of veterans than other colleges. And those colleges with unusually high number of veterans, naturally they would have a greater impact on the enrollment opportunities.
I may have another question, but I think I may want to look maybe more closely between now and the next meeting at impact.
Member Ramos.
Yeah, I'm extremely happy that Member Baca brought up this point exactly, because that to me is what's dispositive. You have to think about proportionality. If this is a small universe of students, even though there may be spikes in the numbers according to military population in some given setting, and it would be relatively easy for us to accommodate all these constituencies, which I think we would all agree are equally needy and deserving. It just seems to me like it doesn't make a lot of sense to bifurcate. If there's some more compelling reason, even beyond those that I've heard about the code and this and that, then I think we should pay attention to that. But I think first and foremost, we need some analysis of what is the actual real-life impact of, going with this kind of a protocol as opposed to lumping those groups together and giving them all a priority status. And I don't know if that's something that's within our reach to be able to do in the short term, but I think in a vacuum, it's hard for me as a member of this board to really understand the rationale beyond just something philosophical that we might sort of, talk about in terms of priority need. So I think that this point about really better charting what are the actual numbers of people that would be affected, what is the capacity of our institutions to absorb those numbers, that's where I'd like to start. I'm wondering if on the next occasion we could have a little bit of data that would tell us that. That would certainly be helpful for me. And it doesn't, I don't know, if the numbers are small, it seems like what we're suggesting is that it shouldn't be that hard to get a grasp on that equation.
I'm looking at my colleague Patrick Perry. I mean, he's willing to help do some analysis. We're just now starting to collect an identifier for veterans and foster youth. We don't have that historically in our database, so we may not be able to be precise, but it can certainly give you some sense of what the degree of magnitude is.
Okay, and just a second thought that relates to this is that, if I heard correctly, several of the folks who testified suggested or articulated a perspective and an experience that these are sometimes very overlapping groups. So in addition to the universe of this population, or set of populations, perspective being manageable, it may be even more so in the fact that you have people that cover 1 or 2 or 3 or 4 of these checkpoints. So that tells me all the more just to be cautious about trying to bifurcate or separate based on my sense of the compelling case that's been made before us for priority registration for all of these groups.
And I would just add that we can look at that data and try to provide as much information as possible, but that data will not protect against the circumstance in which a veteran student who wishes to enroll at some point in the future is unable to enroll, and and says, why did I not get priority when the state law says I should have priority?
Is that happening now? Are there circumstances where that's happening now?
I couldn't say what's happening
We should
now,
find
but
out,
we're
because
we're
we know
talking
students
about.
aren't getting classes now, including priority students. I'm not justifying that. I'm just
Yeah.
saying that's
Right,
not a
and
problem we already have.
I would, you know, agree with the notion that we ought to have some more data. I also think a very compelling point was made by Vice Chancellor Bruckman in that, you know, where do we stop? I mean, why is CalWorks out? Why are other things? At some point in a system, you do need to prioritize and make decisions. So I would hate to, you know, go down a slippery slope, but I think it's right to have some sense and some data points, if they are obtainable, as we make this decision. Chancellor Scott and then Member Valencia.
Well, we can do the data. I just asked Vice Chancellor Perry, and he indicated we could. So that's why we felt like it was good to have it first as an information item, so we could have a thorough discussion. And I mean, I can tell you right offhand that the smallest group is foster youth, right, by far. And the largest group is probably veterans. Maybe EOPS and DSPS are rather large too, but be my guess of all four of these groups that the veterans are the largest and the foster youth are the smallest. And so we'll continue this discussion. You can see what Vice Chancellor Bruckman is saying in the sense that, and there's no question that foster youth and veterans have the highest legal standing, in the sense that, and if a veteran, I imagine today, if some veteran doesn't get the classes that he or she wants, they probably grumble about it and go on. But there's always the possibility that someone could initiate a suit and say, hey, I want to show you what the law says here. And so we'll continue the discussion. This has been a good information item, and I am, along with the rest of the people here, complimentary of this task force. You can see how complex this problem has been, and I think we'll be prepared, though, by the next board meeting to have a first reading after exploring all of this. And remember that a first reading is just that. It's a first reading, and we'll continue this discussion for another 2 months at least. So this is 4 months away from adoption. They're wrestling with a very difficult problem. I haven't been in on the task force, and so I can easily say I have no fixed opinion on this matter, but I do compliment the task force for all that they've done.
Member Belinsky.
Just a question that doesn't need answered, because I've seen different things happening already in terms of priority registration currently in various different districts. But even priority gets defined by the first group maybe gets to register day 1. The second group gets to register day 2 and following. So I mean, there's other issues that come up depending upon how a district chooses to program this. And I've seen that where, you know, this group gets day 1 and every day following, this group gets day 2 and every day following in group 3, and so there's only a few days. And the only other thing I would throw into the mix just to consider as the group continues to talk, not all disabled students register themselves. Because of the nature of the disability, sometimes they have staff registering them. And so there's a staff workload that has to be factored in also, just as the conversation continues.
Other comments? Thank you, Vice Chancellor. Appreciate all the work.